Hello everyone, my name is Jiang Wu, Director of Center for Buddhist Studies and a Professor of East Asian Studies at the University of Arizona. Today, I'm going to introduce to you Chinese Zen Master Yinyuan, or pronounced as Ingen in Japanese. I will also evaluate his Ōbaku legacy in the setting of global East Asia. I will try to answer the question why he still matters in today's world. This year, 2022, is special. A lot has happened all over the world. Some events have changed people's lives significantly. It is no doubt that we are at the juncture of transition. Although the future is uncertain, we all trust the good human nature and believe that the world will get better and better. Among all the things happening around us, I want to mention that this year is the 350th death anniversary of a Chinese Zen monk called Yinyuan, who went to Japan in 1654 and started a splendid cultural tradition called Obaku, which is still alive today. A few weeks ago, the Japanese emperor just gave this monk a new honorific title to commemorate his contributions. A series of memorial events will be held in China, Japan, and the United States. Master Yinyuan lived from 1592 to 1673. His full name is Yinyuan Longqi. Longqi is his Dharma name, and Yinyuan is his literary name. He was born in Fuqing, a coastal town in southeast China. He went to Japan and when he was already 62 years old. In 1661, a new temple called Manpukuji was erected in Kyoto, Japan, and named after Yinyuan Longqi's home monastery at Mount Huangbo in China. In late 17th and 18th centuries, based in this new monastery at Uji, his Ōbaku school spread its influence throughout Japan. After founding the temple in Japan, Yinyuan lived in retirement and passed away at the age of 82. Before I tell you the details about his life, Zen teaching, and practice, let me first give you some historical background about the early modern East Asia, which is roughly the 17th and 18th centuries. Many books have been written about East Asian history in this period. However, very few of them considers the role of religion, especially Buddhism. In this historical process, very often scholars characterize this period as the 17th century crisis because many disastrous events happened during this time, not only in East Asia but also in Europe. These crises include economic and political fiasco, climate change, famine, Japanese invasion of Korea, regime changes such as the fall of the Ming to the Manchu Empire, and the founding of Tokugawa Bakufu in Japan. The world also became global at that time. The American continent was discovered. The European merchants came to Asia, bringing goods, produce, silver from Europe and South America. European missionaries, especially the Jesuits, were also active in China, Japan, and Tibet, spreading the Christian faith aggressively. Internal immigrations within East Asia were also frequent, and the Buddhist monks were among the travelers. However, at this time of crisis, Buddhism showed incredible growth in China and other parts of East Asia. Chan, or Zen Buddhism, underwent significant spiritual and institutional transformations during the 17th century. Yinyuan grew up in this time of crisis in early modern East Asia. He received his Chan training in eastern Zhejiang, which is one of the most developed areas and the homeland of many intellectuals such as Wang Yangming. Yinyuan was deeply immersed in the literati culture of his time and learned the skills of calligraphy and portrait writing. He had participated actively in the Chan disputes concerning the meaning of enlightenment and authentication of Dharma transmission. He claimed that he had inherited authentic transmission of the Linji Sect. His career was interrupted by the Manchu invasion in 1644, and he became a supporter of the resistance movement led by the legendary military leader Zheng Chenggong, who defeated the Dutch and conquered Taiwan in 1661. He was famous in the Western sources as Koxinga. He gave Yinyuan permission to sail to Japan from his military base in Xiamen. To know Master Yinyuan better, we need to start his youth and trace his journey from China to Japan. Yinyuan was born in the small village called Donglin, which was located at the Lingde town of Fuqing. Yinyuan's secular name is Lin Zhengbing. A few years ago, I did field research in Yinyuan's hometown and found his ancestor tombs, lineage shrines, and the temples he was ordained are all preserved very well. The young man Yinyuan developed spiritually at a very early age. He was often puzzled by the mystery of the universe. He was not very interested in secular affairs. Rather, he showed his interests in religion. It seems that Yinyuan also experienced a psychological crisis in his adolescence, probably due to the missing of his father in his early age. His father disappeared during a business trip to Hubei area when Yinyuan was little. The lack of a father figure in his youth must have left an empty space in Yinyuan's mind and had a significant impact when he grew up. At the age of 20, he showed no interest in marriage on the excuse that he should first fulfill his filial duty towards parents. Yinyuan thus planned a trip to search for his missing father. This trip led him to Putuo Island and eventually brought him to the Buddhist faith. Putuo Island was considered the sacred mountain of the Bodhisattva of Guanyin or Avalokitesvara in East Asia. As a pilgrim, Yinyuan was deeply impressed by the power of Guanyin and decided to become a monk after the visit. In 1620, Yinyuan went to Mount Huangbo and was formally ordained as a Buddhist monk. His early monastic career was typical of those monks who lived during his time. As a young man, he was drawn to Buddhism because of his piety to the Buddha and the popular Guanyin cult. After becoming a monk, he immersed himself in monastic learning and literary training. In his adult life, the rise of Chan Buddhism appealed greatly to young monks like Yinyuan. Yinyuan started his monastic training with scriptural studies. He read all the important Buddhist scriptures, such as Scripture of Buddha's remaining teaching, the Nirvana Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, and the Lotus Sutra. However, after several years' study, he became increasingly impatient with the tedious scholastic style. He felt that scriptural studies only show people the way rather than lead them onto the way. In his opinion, years of study were senseless for being released from the cycle of birth and death. Yinyuan decided to visit a famous Chan master, Ming-Yuan, and was later enlightened by him. Because Yinyuan cared about genuine enlightenment experience and hoped his experience can be authenticated by a qualified teacher through personal encounter of Dharma transmission, Mingyuan seems to be the perfect teacher for Yinyuan. Mingyuan was the major Linji master who revived Chan Buddhism in 17th century China. He was particularly famous for using the Chan technique of beating and shouting to train his students. Under the tutelage of Ming-Yuan, he claimed to have attained the Enlightenment experience. Based on this experience, he later received Dharma transmission from Fei Yin Tongrong, which means that he received spiritual acknowledgement Inke or Inca, and an authentic Dharma transmission certificate, which is still preserved in Manpukuji. In 1637, Yinyuan received the invitation from Huangbo. He accepted the invitation and was installed officially as the third abbot of Huangbo Monastery after the temple was revived by Ming-Yuan. Since then, Yinyuan Longqi presided over Huangbo until he left China in 1654. It was under Yinyuan that Huangbo Monastery underwent the most significant transformation. Yinyuan arrived in Nagasaki in 1654 and joined the thriving Chinese community there. Around the time, private trade between China and Japan in Nagasaki was booming. Because the Chinese community flourished, the Chinese residents in Japan needed Chinese monks to provide religious services. The Japanese government also expected the Chinese residents to be registered with local Buddhist temples. At that time, Chinese immigrants founded 3 temples based on where they came from. Sofukuji represented the Chinese from Fuzhou in Fujian. Kofukuji represented the Chinese from the lower Yangtze region, and Fukusaiji represented the Chinese from Zhangzhou and the Quanzhou region in Fujian. After just 1 year's residence in Nagasaki, Yinyuan was able to secure invitation from Japanese monks and authorities to move to a Japanese monastery called Fumonji, close to Osaka. This is a significant move for Yinyuan because the Japanese government did not allow ordinary Chinese residents living outside Nagasaki. After staying in Fumonji for a few years, Yinyuan was allowed to have 2 audiences with the head of the Japanese military government, the so-called Shogun in the Bakufu. The 4th Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu received him in the Edo Castle, which is today's Imperial Palace in Tokyo, during the winter of 1658. Yinyuan must have impressed the general and the Japanese officials. 2 years later, in 1660, the Bakufu made an exception to allow him to build the new temple Manpukuji in Kyoto. Moreover, for the next 100 years, only Chinese monks were appointed as the abbot of Manpukuji, and these Chinese abbots were frequently invited to visit Edo. From 1661 to 1784, 11 Chinese abbots made 21 visits to the Edo Castle, and each time they were well received by the Bakufu. It is no doubt Yinyuan was influential during his time. In the heyday of this tradition, there were about 1,200 Ōbaku temples in Japan. Yinyuan's Ōbaku tradition left clear marks on modern Japanese Buddhism. Because of the changes Ōbaku Zen brought to Japan, Yanagita Seisan, a leading scholar in the field of Chan history, created the term Ōbakunization to describe the Ōbaku impact. In an article evaluating these influences, Yanagita regards Manpukuji the center of transformations because reforms of Japanese Zen Buddhism originated from there. According to him, Ōbaku culture has penetrated all aspects of Japanese culture. First, According to him, the establishment of Manpukuji symbolized the transmission of Chinese culture in Japan, especially in the realm of Buddhism. For example, Yinyuan's disciple, the Ōbaku monk Tetsugen Doko, published the Ōbaku Buddhist canon, which had a significant impact on Japanese printing and on the compilation of modern Buddhist canon in Japan. Soto Zen was also reformed during this time, under the influence of Ōbaku tradition. Soto monks rediscovered the philosophy of Dogen and published Dogen's Treasures of True Dharma Eyes. Linji Zen monks Hyakuin lived shortly after Yinyuan and reformed the Linji practice. But the development of Hyakuin Zen must be considered especially as a direct response to Yinyuan and his Ōbaku tradition. Second, Yinyuan's Ōbaku tradition influenced the Japanese intellectual world. Famous intellectuals in Edo, such as Ogyo Solai, were eager to learn Chinese culture from Ōbaku monks and even practiced colloquial Chinese with them. These interactions had impacted several intellectual traditions, such as learning of Wanyang Ming, Yumekaku, and the learning of Mito domain, the Mitogaku, Asian philosophy and the rhetoric, and the national learning. Third, Yinyuan's Ōbaku culture also changed the taste of the literati and influenced the Japanese diet, such as preparation of the tea and the creation of the sencha tradition. We all know Japan is famous for the matcha style of tea ceremony. However, because of the arrival of Yinyuan and his fellow Chinese monks, a new tradition, sencha, was developed based on brewing loose tea leaves. Another example is the introduction of Ingen mame, a kind of a string bean named after Yinyuan Longqi. Ingen mame became popular in the Japanese diet and is still loved by Japanese people today. In sum, the transmission of Chinese culture by Yinyuan has triggered tremendous changes. As Yanagita Seizan said, no matter which orientation of modern Japanese society one considers, without the impact of Ōbaku culture, there's no way to explain it. Why was Yinyuan so influential? To answer this question, we have to look at his teaching and practice. Yinyuan's Zen teaching is nothing new to students of East Asian Buddhism. His Zen thought is based on a body of rich Zen literature, such as the recorded sayings created during the Tang Dynasty and canonized in the Song Dynasty. Recorded sayings, or yulu in Chinese, goloku in Japanese, are collections of Chan master's sermons and encounter dialogues between teachers and disciples. For example, Yinyuan Longqi often singled out the recorded sayings of Master Linji as the spiritual source of his teaching and practice. In these records, people can see that Chinese Zen masters often behaved strangely during their encounters with students. They responded to students' questions not directly, but with enigmatic actions, such as beating and shouting. This kind of interaction was often written down as encounter dialogues and the so-called koan, or the public cases. Scholars usually described this kind of unconventional teaching and practice iconoclastic and antinomian, because the intention of these behaviors was to create a sense of enlightenment. In the 17th century, this Chan training method was revived in China, and Yinyuan's teachers, Mingyun and Feiyin, were two major figures in this revival movement. They often performed the ritual of ascending the hall where encounter dialogues were performed. To a large extent, Yinyuan's contribution lies in his ability to uphold his iconoclastic Zen style. In his performance of Encounter Dialogue, Yinyuan demonstrated the Zen rhetoric of spontaneity and immediacy. His recorded sayings were intended to create such a radical image of an iconoclastic Zen spirit. This is because that Yinyuan believed enlightenment was attainable through sudden experience and encounter dialogue. He claimed that he had a profound enlightenment experience as well. Then let's look closer at Yinyuan's enlightenment experience. This is a rare case for us to examine such kind of higher consciousness of a human being. Yinyuan's moment of enlightenment suddenly came in one morning in 1621 when he was 35 years old. In that year, he was under the supervision of a Chan teacher called Five Peaks. One day, he had an encounter dialogue with Master Five Peaks. When he saw Master Five Peaks, he immediately waved his fist before Five Peaks and challenged him. Knowing this, the world has peace. Knowing this, the world competes. How to solve this? Master Five Peaks asked, "Where did you learn all this?" Without reply, Yinyuan uttered a shout. Five Peaks asked again, "Tell me where you learned it." Yinyuan shouted again. Master Five Peaks then hit him. Yinyuan shouted twice in a row, and Master Five Peaks replied with 2 strikes. All his fellow monks believed that in this encounter, Yinyuan was defeated. There was no positive results out of the encounter. After the encounter, Yinyuan was so frustrated that he began to behave strangely. He walked angrily without seeing anybody and without feeling the existence of his own body. He only came back to normal consciousness until the next morning, when he learned that the chiming sound of the bell during the morning chanting service. Finally, the enlightenment experience occurred in the 3rd day. According to his biography, in the morning, when a gust of wind suddenly blew from outside the window, his hair stood on end all of a sudden. His whole body began to sweat, and he completely illuminated his ultimate orange. The truth is crystal clear without duality and without distinction. He felt this experience cannot be described to others with any possible examples. It can be only learned through self-verification. He knew that he was enlightened, but he had no way to tell others. Out of joy, he smiled to whoever he met. His smile must have looked so weird that his fellow monks even thought he was bewitched. When he was asked to demonstrate his supreme understanding of truth in front of everyone, Yinyuan said, "This is not difficult, but I'm afraid that my answer will scare everyone." Then Yinyuan's answer indeed surprised everyone. He left the room by turning a somersault. Yinyuan's enlightenment experience has a profound impact for him. Through rigorous Zen training, which served to internalize Zen teaching and practice, Yinyuan was able to go through a psychological transformation to achieve an exceptional human experience. Such an experience functioned as an internal source for authenticating Yinyuan's understanding of Zen. In an intuitive way, one's true self was discovered and the Buddha nature was present through this kind of an unconventional encounter dialogue. Yinyuan's success in China and Japan lies in his Zen teaching and practice. Because of Yinyuan's spiritual ability to perform koan and encounter dialogue, Yinyuan and his Chinese disciples emphasized that their teaching and practice were both authentic and orthodox. Because of this claim, they achieved a great success to attract students and support from donors to establish their Dharma transmission and the monastic network. Basically, Yinyuan emphasized the two principles. First, he claimed that his Ōbaku lineage represented the authentic transmission in the Linji tradition. This statement demonstrates the power of his claim of religious purity and authenticity. For the purpose of claiming authenticity, Yinyuan's master Fei Yin Tongrong's work, Strict Transmission of the Five Chan Schools, served as a powerful ideological weapon to establish the correct ways of Dharma transmission. This book established the second principle. The second principle is that the authenticity of a Chan lineage relies on a strict definition of Dharma transmission through personal encounters between master and disciple. As a result, this principle of rationalized the process of Dharma transmission and denied the possible false claims and unwarranted practices such as transmission by proxy and remote inheritance. Basically, what Yinyuan did is to rationalize Dharma transmission and organize the monks and the monasteries into a hierarchical structure that prepared for the next step of institutionalization. These two principles not only played a role in the early development of the Ōbaku school, but also exerted a visible impact on Japanese Buddhism in the Tokugawa period. Both Rinzai and Soto traditions were affected by Yinyuan's ideal of authenticity. However, a careful reading of the complete collection of his writings shows that his Buddhist teaching was quite conventional, as he supported a variety of traditional Buddhist practices, rather than the iconoclastic Zen practice only. In other words, he preferred a much balanced program of spiritual cultivation. For example, it is commonly known that a typical Zen master defines the authority of scriptures and Buddhist canons because Zen does not rely on written words, and its teaching belongs to a separate transmission outside scriptures. However, some of Yinyuan's poems reveal that he did not radically reject scriptures. In his retirement years in Japan, he developed a routine to read one fascicles of the Avatamsaka Sutra every day. His then thought was influenced by the teaching of Buddha nature, as seen in the treatise on the weakening of a face and the Surangama Sutra. According to these scriptures, the world is originated from the single pure mind, which contains two aspects, enlightenment and the samsara. Because of ignorance, human beings fell in samsara. Only through awakening, one can recover the pure mind. Here, following the teaching of Tathagata Garbha thought, he considers Buddha nature lies in one's own pure mind. The cause of samsara, however, is the thought of ignorance, which beclouded the original mind. Then Buddhist cultivation is aimed to recover this beclouded mind and the authentic self. The ultimate goal of his teaching was to enable his students to reach enlightenment, the ultimate experience of authenticity. However, he emphasized that this kind of authentic experience must be based on one's own effort. Yinyuan deeply respected the Buddhist canon as well, and was eager to help to spread it. The Chinese Buddhist monastery was revived because of the bestowal of the Ming Northern Buddhist canon from Emperor Wanli. When Yinyuan landed in Japan, he valued the Buddhist canon as a way to spread Buddhism and gave one copy of the entire canon to his Japanese disciple Tezugen, who created the Ōbaku canon. The printing blocks of the canon are still preserved very well in Manpukuji. In practice, Yinyuan was much more conventional about teaching his disciples the basic Buddhist doctrine of transmigration and the karma to inculcate a strong Buddhist faith. For him, faith in Buddhist teaching is essential. He divided all people into 5 categories according to their levels of faith in Buddhism. There are people of correct faith, false faith, natural faith by birth, acquired faith through education, and complete unfaithful till death. Therefore, Yinyuan believed that there must be different ways of teaching them. He wholeheartedly believed in karma and transformation, and thus became a supporter of releasing animals, influenced by the prevalence of animal releasing rituals promoted by the late Ming eminent monk Zhu Hong. Yinyuan participated in numerous such ceremonies and wrote many poems to encourage such activities. After Manpukuji was founded, Yinyuan had made releasing animals a routine ritual every month. Under his guidance, a pond for releasing fish was built in Manpukuji in 1664. 3 years later, a lotus society was organized for releasing lives and rebirths in Pure Land. There is something else that made Yinyuan popular in Japan. Because Yinyuan came from China as a monk, but also as a poet, calligrapher, and artist. Yinyuan had been accepted by the Japanese as representing the authentic civilization from China. Growing up in the late Ming Literati culture, Yinyuan belonged to a group of elite monks who had been gentrified and well-versed in literati activities such as poetry writing, calligraphy, seal carving, painting, music, and the art of tea drinking. Calligraphy is one of the cultural legacies of Yinyuan's Ōbaku school. As Stephen Addis observed, Ōbaku calligraphy, though bold and massive, is remarkably fluent and much more curvilinear and graceful, yet it does not sacrifice strength and power. Yinyuan was an accomplished calligrapher, and his works were thought after by many Japanese as precious cultural assets for display. His strokes were bold and strong with pressure and life. They were exercised freely, but with force, which can be felt from their executions. The beginning of stroke is always strong and saturated. What follows is a series of quick moves of the brush, as if motivated by the vital force, as calligraphers always claimed. All parts of his work formed an inseparable unity, with skillful turns of the tips of the brush when making transitions. Yinyuan's works thus impressed the people with force, life, and speed. Nowadays, together with his 2 disciples, Jifei Ruyi and Muan Xingdao, Yinyuan was acclaimed as one of the 3 brushes of Ōbaku for his calligraphic style. In addition to calligraphy, Ōbaku painting, portrait painting is also considered as having influenced the Japanese portrait painting significantly. Through Chinese Ōbaku painter Yang Daozhen and his 2 Japanese disciples in the Ōbaku school, Kita Chobei and Kita Genki. This new style of painting influenced a group of Chinese painters. Manpukuji's architecture and the sculpture modeling of a Buddha statue inside the monastery were marveled at as a full demonstration of the 17th century Chinese architecture and craftsmanship. Yinyuan's mastery of literary and artistic skills made him one of the highly respected eminent monks with elegant literary style and taste. In addition, he and his disciples brought the Ming dynasty culture, such as the tea ceremony, to Japan as well. Many exotic Ming items, such as furniture, dresses, plants, were named after him because they were brought from China around the same time when Yinyuan arrived. The building of Manpukuji, much like a cultural museum, became a showcase of the richness of Chinese culture. All these aspects, more cultural than religious, are often regarded as the major characteristics of the so-called Ōbaku culture. Yinyuan's cultural achievements won him literary reputation in Japan, and his disciples of later generations continued his literary tradition. An indispensable literary skill of a gentrified monk was the poetry writing, and Yinyuan was an accomplished practitioner of the art. He was a poet and kept writing throughout his life. He wrote about 5,000 poems in his lifetime, and most of them were produced after he arrived in Japan. After he built Manpukuji, he wrote more than 3,000 poems, and the majority of them were written during his retirement. His poems composed in Japan reflected his constant longing of his homeland and his inspiration for the ideal of transcendence. Yinyuan had tried all different kinds of poetic categories, such as the old-style poems, regulated verses, quatrains, and the yuefu ballads. Yinyuan's poem can be classified as a typical mountain-dwelling poems. Mountain-dwelling poetry is a loose category to describe monastic's poetic creation. Most of these poems either marked as mountain-dwelling in its title or content, or their themes closely related to the condition of living in the natural world, such as mountains, lakes, boats, and villages, etc. Clearly, mountain-dwelling poetry is a type of landscape poems in the Chinese poetic tradition and was favored by monks and recluses. Because he loved Mount Fuji so much, he built a miniature Mount Fuji in his abbot's compound and wrote several poems about Mount Fuji. One of the poems is as follows. I translated this poem, and it was being polished by my friend Bill Potter, who was also known as Red Pine. Us both with white hair and me old besides. Facing each other, we think the same thought. I would say something deep, but I have nothing to say. I'm relying on you to keep all this going forever. In this poem, he considered the mountain as a metaphor for himself. An old and a white-haired man standing alone and aloof. The snowed crest, as he imagined, just matched his own appearance, an old monk with snow-white hair. His longing grew during his retirement years as he knew that he would never be able to visit the mountain again. After the death of Yinyuan, his Chinese successors, such as Gaoquan Xingdun, Qiandai Xing'an, Yuefeng Daozhang, Zhuan Jingyin, Dapeng Zhengkun, frequently traveled from Kyoto to Edo and brought the Chinese cultural heritage to the political and the cultural center of Japan. Their presence in mid-Edo Japan was welcomed by the Japanese literati class. It is not an exaggeration that the cultural ideal imported from China and represented by Chinese monks had been interwoven into the Edo literati culture. The year 2022 marks the 350th death anniversary of Zen Master Yinyuan Longqi. The anniversary of an eminent master's death is an important occasion for commemoration in much of the Buddhist world. We're pleased to announce that the Center for Buddhist Studies in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona is organizing a series of commemorative events which will run for 1 year, beginning May 3rd, 2022. These events will present and explore the extraordinary life of Zen Master Yinyuan and the great achievements of the Huangbo tradition of Zen Buddhism that he pioneered in China and Japan. These events highlight the intersection between religion, art, culture in China and Japan, and will be presented in both online and offline formats. Activities will include an online exhibition of works of art related to Ōbaku tradition, academic lectures, music performance, and tea-related events. The online art exhibition entitled True Image, celebrating the legacy of Yinyuan Longqi and the art of Ōbaku, is a highlight of our program. Please visit our website at ingen.arizona.edu for more information. In the future lectures, my colleagues will elaborate further on Yinyuan's contribution in calligraphy, portrait painting, and the tea ceremony, so stay tuned. At the end, I want to thank our sponsor, Wanfu Monastery in Fuqing, China. Recently, Wanfu Temple has been completely rebuilt and revitalized under the leadership of Abbot Venerable Dingming. It is now a beautiful place and becomes a new center for spiritual and cultural transformation. We anticipate a bright future for Yinyuan's tradition in both China and Japan. Yinyuan passed away 350 years ago. When we look back and examine his teaching and practice, we can still feel he is talking to us and asks us to think about these important questions. Who are we? What is the relation between us and the world? What is the meaning of enlightenment? How to live an enriched human life, spiritually, culturally, and artistically? To answer these questions, more studies need to be done about Yinyuan and his Ōbaku tradition. Thank you for your attention.